Yep. Okay. So welcome, folks. Good afternoon. Glad you could join us today for Supporting Rural Colleges Through Collaborations, our sixth virtual meeting in the Forum and Alliance virtual meeting series. As everyone comes into the room, I just want to remind you we've got folks on mute and your cameras are off. But we do have our Q&A and chat box going, and we are recording this session. At the conclusion of today's session, we will be following up with an email survey. We hope everyone can take some time to fill that out. In addition, we will be posting the recording and any related support documents up on the Alliance and Forum virtual meeting pages. If you're dropped from the meeting, please log back in, or if you're having technical difficulties, you could use the chat box to reach out to our K to help you. I'd also like to take a moment and recognize our sponsors who have supported us throughout this pandemic and for several years running. Civitas Learning, College Board, Western Governors University, TIAA, New Mexico Military Institute, and lastly, Academic Search. And I'm going to hand this over just for a few minutes to Wanda Bigham, who is going to provide some words on behalf of Academic Search.
Oh, thank you, Anna. Delighted to be with you today. As I've been with you many times before, either on Zoom or in person, I've participated on behalf of Academic Search for a number of years in the Leadership Academy, and so have met some of you through that, enjoyed that a lot. I always say to the people who are in the Academy that if they're interested in having me evaluate their CV, talk about their path, a career path, I'm glad to do that. And I would say that the same thing to any of you who are on the Zoom meeting today. Academic Search, as you may know, is the earliest of the search firms. It's now been in business for 44 years. And as you can imagine, it's changed a lot over those years, from paper and pencil to a lot of technology. And we're very happy in Academic Search that we have very superior search processes and technology to support that. The earliest people in the Academic Search business were people who came out of colleges and universities, as I have and as my colleagues have. Academic Search continues to reach out to those who've been presidents, vice presidents, deans to actually do the search. In my own case, I've been a director, an associate dean, a vice president for development, and twice I've been a college president. And then for the last 9 years, I have worked with Academic Search. And I've been fortunate to work with many of the institutions that are in your association, and delighted to do that. The search business, of course, is a matter of trying to find out what you want, write it up in such a way that it will be appealing. And as you know, you start with an advertisement and you start with email blasts. But that's not enough. And I think the thing we bring to this is a hand-sourced way of going about identifying people who may be interested and who may fit at your institutions. And we work very hard at that, using not only what we know, but what our colleagues know, and reaching out to those who seem most likely to fit. And in fact, our data that say, how long do people stay at institutions? If you think about your own institutions, people are coming and going. And I see many CVs that are 2 or 3 years and they've moved on and they've moved on. The people we place, we have a track record of 93% of presidents being there after 5 years, 92% of deans being there after 5 years, and 93% of vice presidents being there. So that's a pretty good track record, and we're pleased about that. And the final thing I would say to you is that we're very proud of the fact that 6 out of 10 of the people whom we place are women or persons of color. I saw in the Chronicle just this week an article that says nothing is changing in terms of doing searches and finding diverse candidates. And I say to you, we can document, we can share with you the things that we have done to find those diverse people to come into higher ed leadership. So call on me if I can help you. Call on me if I can help you personally in regard to your CV or career path. And certainly my colleagues and I are eager to serve you in your doing your searches. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Wanda. And next, I'm delighted to introduce today's moderator, David Shintani, Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education at University of Nevada, Reno. My apologies.
Hi, thank you, Anna. As an administrator from a land-grant university in a state that has a significant rural population, I'm very interested in today's discussion on how institutions of higher education can best serve these communities, especially during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So while our previous forum discussions have focused on COVID-19 and its impact on larger and more urban university settings, it's important that we also discuss the unique challenges that are facing our rural serving institutions in this COVID era. So I'd like to start things off by introducing our panelists. Our first panelist is Margaret Campbell. Margaret has served as the Director of American Indian Education, has been a tribal liaison and special advisor to the Chancellor of the Montana State University Northern since 2017. She is currently the Chief Diversity Officer and Advisor to the Chancellor of MSUN. Margaret was a graduate of Montana State University Northern, where she received 3 degrees, an AS in Business Administration, a BS in Business Education, and a Master of Education in Vocational Education. Margaret went on to receive her EDD from the University of Montana. Our second panelist is going to be Kyle Dalpy. Kyle serves as a provost and vice president of finance at Western Nevada College in Carson City, Nevada. He's very familiar with higher education in Nevada and worked more than 23 years in supporting students' services and success. Kyle has previously served in a leadership role at Truckee Meadows Community Colleges in Reno. Kyle earned his BA in photojournalism from the University of Connecticut, an MA degree in journalism, speech, and political science from the University of Texas at Tyler, and his PhD in educational leadership from the University of Nevada, Reno. Our third panelist is Sheila Martin. Sheila is the Vice President of Economic Development and Community Engagement at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. She's engaged with senior university leaders and policy stakeholders on issues related to talent and workforce development, innovation, entrepreneurship, and social and cultural and community engagement. Sheila earned her BA in Economics and Political Science from Southern Illinois University, an MA in International Studies from the University of Kentucky, and a PhD in Economics from Iowa State University. Welcome, Margaret, Kyle, and Sheila. And I'll pass it on to Sheila, will be our first speaker.
Well, thank you, David, for that introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this great panel. And my lens on this issue of the impact of the pandemic on rural institutions is really from the perspective of the partnerships that rural higher education institutions have with their communities. We know that the fates of rural located institutions and the fates of their communities are intertwined. A healthy higher ed institution has great economic benefits for the community, and a thriving community generates quality of life for students, faculty, and staff. But that mutual benefit depends on a strong relationship between the institution and the community. And those relationships need to be developed over a long period of time and can become strained. I think especially in the case of the pandemic, if the community suspects that the higher ed institution is the source of a COVID outbreak, or when the health of the local economy is suffering because that higher ed institution is closing and sending their students home, that relationship can be even more strained. So keeping the lines of communication open with community leaders and community organizations is particularly important now. And in fact, it's been really essential to COVID responses in rural college communities. Many of the institutions that I have, the leaders that I've spoken with who work with their communities, they have worked very hard with their local governments and with their business coalitions and with their nonprofits to set up testing sites, to do contact tracing, to support small businesses, and to do things like helping manufacturers pivot to respond to supply chain shortages, to respond to demands for PPE and other critical materials in response to COVID. And they've even done things like open up 3D printing labs in order to make those available to respond to those kinds of shortages. So that's just one example of how our institutions are working with their communities to respond to the pandemic. But that relationship can be a huge challenge and very difficult to maintain during this time. Another huge challenge facing rural located institutions, and in fact, really all higher ed institutions during the pandemic, has been maintaining engaged learning. Now, we know that engaged learning is a high impact practice, and it's a practice that helps keep our students in school, teaches them important 21st century skills like teamwork, cross-cultural communication. It generates understanding and commitment to civic engagement. And for many of our institutions, it's an integral part of their community engagement. But how do we maintain that engaged learning in a remote environment when we're used to face-to-face participation and engagement with community organizations and our local governments? Well, the higher education institutions have had to reinvent their practices with respect to engaged learning. And APLU has been hosting a learning community about engaged learning online that's been hosted by Jorge Atiles from West Virginia University and Judith Romali from Portland State University. And truly, this was a question even before the pandemic. As more and more classes were being put online, students were demanding that they also include an engaged component because they also want to develop those important skills that you can get from engaged learning. But like everything else, the pandemic accelerated this trend and forced our institutions into some really quick innovation. So faculty identified opportunities for students like facilitating remote meetings, conducting online research, developing graphics, doing social media work for nonprofits, even helping with things like small business support services that I mentioned earlier, helping them apply for PPP loans. And there was really a lot of creative invention that was happening in that space. So when I'm finished talking, I'll drop some resources into the chat. You can take a look at those when you have an opportunity. Now, another important challenge, one that intersects with the town-gown relationship that I mentioned earlier, was getting an accurate census count when campuses and college towns were emptying. This might seem like a side issue, but very important to small communities who depend on their campus communities. The census instructions on this were very confusing and they were changing constantly. And in fact, students were supposed to be counted wherever they would have lived on April 1st, 2020, in the absence of the pandemic. And so campuses were trying to address this problem by doing extra outreach to help parents understand the importance of counting, making sure that their students were counted in their college communities. But parents and students were very confused about this. And a lot of our host communities worried that their census counts would be low, with really serious implications for their community funding. So for example, in State College, Pennsylvania, census response rates in neighborhoods that had a lot of off-campus students pretty late in the census game were only coming in at about 25%, the response rates in some of those neighborhoods. And estimates of up to $28,000 in lost revenue per missed resident are not uncommon. So that's can be up to $28,000 for a community in lost revenue if those students aren't counted. And so that can really limit the availability of services and amenities for college towns in the future, which affects not only our communities, but our campuses as well. So the last challenge I want to talk about is access to broadband. Obviously, this is a huge challenge for higher ed institutions who are trying to figure out how to keep their students learning if they don't have broadband needed to complete their coursework online once they leave campus. And this is not a small or insignificant problem. According to the 2018 American Community Survey, 15% of college students lived in households that did not have access to broadband internet, and 4% had no internet access at all. And for students of color and tribal students, these statistics were even worse, with more than 20% of these students without access to broadband. So I'll drop another set of resources into the chat that may help institutions think about their outreach to students who may not have resources. That's my opening statement, and I look forward to continued conversation about these issues as we move forward. And so I'll turn it back to David to introduce our next panelist.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sheila. Our next panelist is going to be Margaret Campbell. And so Margaret, welcome.
Good morning. Coming from Montana State University Northern, I think it's really important to mention that we have around 1 million people in the entire state. So we are definitely rural. I had a lot of experience working with tribal colleges prior to coming to Montana State University Northern and working in rural K-12 in schools as a district superintendent. So I was very familiar with the with rural challenges to K-12. And now I'm going to be discussing some of the challenges that we've had in rural Montana regarding higher ed and how we handled it at Montana State University Northern. When we were caught with during spring break and told that we were going to have to convert from face-to-face to online, it was a real shock. We weren't ready for it, as many institutions weren't, but we were pretty quick on our feet. And I think that if we ever run into a situation like this, we already have a pretty good plan for how we would react. One of the first things that we had to do, because remember now we had all of our students back in Florida, California, Utah, Arizona. Some of them left for spring break and they left their laptops and all of their books because they planned on having fun and they'd worry about that when they got back. So one of the things we had to do is among our staff, that's the Little River Nasanti staff and myself, we called every Native American student. We had to do a quick assessment of their individual needs. And it was very important that that be accurate. So some of them, it was just a process of going to their dorm rooms and having their laptops sent to them along with their books. With others, we actually had to provide laptops and hotspots and things like that. It was very important to us that we supported each student's individual needs for technology and for connectivity. And in rural Montana, we have several rural co-ops. In fact, our state is basically made up of rural co-ops. That required that we, our staff, begin calling these rural co-ops and their leadership to start talking about getting deals on hotspots. Because a lot of our Native students don't have a lot of money, and they went back home to homes where people were working from home, children, K-12 students were trying to do their homework from home. So it was really important that we were able to make sure that we provided hotspots. And what we found out later is that the hotspots we provided actually helped everybody in the home deal with COVID, not just the student. And that created a lot of support from those families, knowing that the university was willing to do that for them. Created some real good relationships. So what we started doing immediately, within a week, we had students connected to Skype for Business, Zoom, WebEx. We were looking at every conceivable way that we could tutor and make it as interactive as possible. Some platforms or applications work better than the others, but we were able to work with every single student. We maintained engaged learning through cultural responsive tutoring and mentoring. We did that on Zoom. We worked in the evenings. We tried to find time when students were available. If they said their parents were using the desktop during the day and there were kids, children from the local schools using the desktop for their online learning, sometimes we had to set these mentoring sessions up in the evening to be able to accommodate the students in the time that was best for them. That also meant that we were working some real long hours. We'd work all day, then we would work into the evening doing a lot of the virtual mentoring and tutoring. We assisted students in creating a study space by reorganizing a spot in their home. And that was something that was unique. We had the students kind of do a quick video of the room that they were in, because a lot of them were indicating they just didn't have their own space to study. So we set up a model room. We worked with a couple of the students. One was in Florida, one was in South Dakota on the Indian reservation. And we actually set up rooms where we had them get little tables and lamps and make a space that was real conducive to studying, because at this point, they didn't really feel like studying. They felt kind of out of reach from their instructors. They didn't have their other students that they were used to being around them. And so before they could get detached from their classes, we knew we had to create study spaces. And then with that, we used that model to show other students how they can create study spaces in their home. With one student, we found that his study space was in his parents' garage. He had a nice big spacious area where he had his laptop and he was able to study freely without being bothered by school children and parents. We created virtual study groups with 5 to 8 students per setting to maximize our time. So if we had 5 to 8 students that all needed to work in algebra, we would bring them all together in Zoom, WebEx, or Skype for Business, and we would tutor them in that area. We would make sure that they were able to communicate with each other. We had them exchange telephone numbers, emails, so that they could speak to each other outside of class, because prior to that, they were all in class together and there was no need for that. We provided professional development for faculty to create an awareness of student issues with remote learning. A lot of our faculty weren't aware of what they were dealing with. So we did some professional development to let them know these are the issues that we're dealing with out in rural Montana, so please be patient. And that was very beneficial. The faculty were very appreciative that we made them aware of just how challenging it was for our students to, number one, get connected, and number two, stay connected. Then we located and engaged mental health providers from various communities, counselors to participate in virtual meetings, to connect with students experiencing depression and other mental health issues. And that took a little bit longer. We had to find community health centers that were open to counseling, and many of them had to do it over the telephone. If it was on an Indian reservation, I contacted Indian Health Services, mental health services, to see if they would be able to make themselves available. That was a lot of work. In fact, I would say that of all of the work that we did, that was probably the most difficult, because sometimes you'd call 3 or 4 providers before you could get one that was willing to provide services for the students. And then we didn't know the communities that our students were in. So it took a lot of Googling and searching just to find out who to call in the first place. That was well worth our time. We have literally had students say that saved them, that they would not have finished the semester. Some of them said they were okay academically, but emotionally, they were just so detached and they were reaching depression. So that's something that I think that if we ever find ourselves in a similar situation, we will certainly employ that strategy again. And one of the reasons for the mental health problems was the high death rates on American Indian reservations. This had a very negative effect. We have students that have lost 4 members of their family since COVID, and that made it very difficult just because of the cultural issues and the way that tribal people bury their members. All of those things were no longer unavailable. So students felt depressed. They felt like they weren't able to fulfill their cultural obligations because they couldn't attend wakes or pipe ceremonies or any of the ceremonies that are real critical to American Indians as they bury their people. We had to implement holistic advising to keep students engaged in their program of study. So beyond tutoring and mental health, we would work with students individually and give them their program of study and make sure they understand you have to pass these courses this semester, because 3 of these courses won't be offered until next year, and that'll throw you off graduation. But by really getting them involved in their program of study and talking to them about when each course is offered and helping them understand how essential it is that they pass each of their courses, that was really important. It connected faculty with students when they were away in ways that we probably would never have experienced. Most importantly, we maintain communications with our students regularly to ensure consistent engagement. Our students will tell you that they were contacted up to 3 times per week. That is just to check on them and see how they're doing. And that was sometimes outside of the Zoom tutoring and WebEx tutoring that we were able to conduct. The students that returned to us in the fall semester have indicated that the strategies that we used were what kept them in school. And I'm sure they were being generous when they said that, but it makes me feel good to know that we really bent over backwards to make sure that our students had everything that they needed. And in this case, it did pay off. We did not lose our our retention rate of American Indian students did not go down. And in fact, we increased the percentage of Native American students on our campus this fall. That concludes my presentation. If anyone would like to visit with me more about strategies and more specificity, please contact me, and I'd be more than willing to share with you what we did for our students at Montana State University Northern.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great presentation. I'd like to move on to Kyle Dalby from Western Nevada College. Kyle.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. I'm looking at the attendee list. I recognize some names, but I can't see faces, but I hope you're all safe and having a great day. Good to see you. Good to meet all of you. A lot of the same themes that I'll present, and I'll try to take it a little bit of different direction to offer up some variety, because we're definitely seeing everything that's been said to this point at Western Nevada College. We serve a service area of about 190,000 people in 5 counties, rural district, and our student population about 3,000 students. And so what I would do, one of the things I found most enlightening in my job, I serve as provost, which means I'm over all of instruction. And because of budget reductions, I was given finance, which means I'm over all of the money. Those 2 pieces are like the biggest piece, because our state started to go into a tailspin like many of the others on the budget side. And so not only did we need to have a COVID plan, but we had to figure out the financial piece. And I kind of like it. It's unusual, but at least this way I know the decisions are first and foremost about the students and instruction, even though we don't have a lot to work with because there are budget reductions. But if I also in my infinite free time have been able to teach a couple classes, which has been extremely enlightening. So at this point in time, although I can't see your faces, I would tell my class to please look at the screen, take a look at the student in the photo. That student is smiling bigger than you would have ever imagined. Because in June of 2020, we were able to have a drive-through graduation in the circle out in front of the house, where we let one graduate would walk by themselves and their car would follow them, and we'd get up on stage masked up and would have would have a little bit of a ceremony. We'd even shake hands. We had gloves on, the whole deal. But we tried to maintain some normalcy. And as you've heard, it's the students right now that I think are, of course, they're having the biggest impact. And when we talk about the mental health issues that are emerging now, a year ago, 9 months ago, we didn't really know what was coming. And so we're working through that now. But back then, we're still trying to do things under a normal way of doing it, at least having a graduation or a commencement ceremony. And I think it helped. We just put about 50 students through. We didn't get our normal, but again, June of 2020. So a couple of things I'll mention on the, and I'll skew it a little bit toward instructional plans and funding. The tech connectivity issues that were mentioned by Margaret and Sheila definitely affected our areas. We had students driving in from rural places to sit in front of maybe even a McDonald's or some store that advertised they had Wi-Fi to submit papers. And that kind of impact is huge. And when we brought students back in the fall, we found that there was classes that some were on site and some were online on Zoom, and students had a 15-minute window to get home to get onto their classes. And so we made spaces using our conference rooms on campus because they weren't being used for conferences. We're all doing Zoom. And we allowed students to go in there, socially distanced, a certain number per room that we let them access. So, they were able to do that without having to run home and could actually be on campus, provided they protected themselves. One thing I want to throw out to the group: if you are a rural institution, and I'm not a betting man, although I've been in Nevada for 20 years, but back in September of 19, pre-pandemic, we started framing out a grant to the U.S. Department of Agriculture for rural, it's called the Rural Utilities Distance Learning Grant, which would have used Zoom technology. And if I had bought Zoom stock at that point in time, I'd probably be somewhere else right now, sitting on a beach, enjoying, doing something, because I would have made all the money off that stock provided they keep moving up. But the thing is that we already started talking about access using Zoom technology, which got us ahead of the curve. So if you want more information on that, you have my information. I can put you in touch with the grant if some of you are familiar with that. We were able to hit submit on that grant in April of 2020 and received $500,000 to build up a Zoom network, which is perfect timing, right? We didn't know it, but it was perfect timing. So that's something that we're working on, trying to keep moving forward. So more on that. I can talk more about that later. I want to talk about partnerships. This is a budget piece. We have several partnerships with the school districts. There's 5 counties, so 5 districts plus a charter school. That's 6 districts. All of them lost their state funding for what we call, it's a career and college readiness grant, and that's what they use to pay for dual enrollment. And those schools immediately said, we can't fund our students. And so because I oversee finance as well, and I'm sure many of you have had these struggles of how can we spend the federal higher education relief fund money and stay within the boundaries of what's permitted. And so we've been doing a lot of shuffling of funds here and there to try to maintain these dual enrollment partnerships, because if nothing is more disheartening than a group of seniors moving into their senior year without having done the normal things in high school, we want to at least be able to give them the college experience. And so that's something that really showed up on our radar. I'll jump real quick and spend 1 minute, and then I'll be done on the next slide if we could. One thing I wanted to mention was we maintained program continuity in our allied health programs. We had nurses graduate in May of 2020 after spending time on campus. We had our first cohort of paramedic students start in spring of 2020, and they just graduated last month. It's a 1-year program. And one of the things we did was we worked with the governor's office here in the state, and we said, we know the world is shut down, but we have to get these students through, and they have to have hands-on experience to be able to do 2 things. One, to progress their careers through, but also to be the relief for the frontline workers. And again, we were having this discussion back in April of 2020. How can we continue to put students out who are highly qualified to be able to already join a workforce that needs people, but also be able to give some relief to the front lines? And so we kept them open on campus. And I did an interview after the graduation ceremony, and I got thinking, thinking this through, a lot of students had a very unfortunate experience with higher education at the end of spring. I've got one in my family who went off to school and lost the first year experience because she had to turn around and come right back. A lot of them had that experience. Our EMS paramedic students actually had a different experience because they were the only ones on campus. And so they had run of the campus. I mean, they actually had a culture shock when everybody started coming back over the summer, because they were wearing masks, but they were running their ambulance around and they were doing, I mean, all kinds of things. So they actually had a different experience. And although there's nothing positive to come out of the trials and tribulations of the pandemic, at least seeing a group be successful was a crowning moment last month when we walked them across the stage. So with that, I'll stop and follow up on any of those bullet points in the Q&A. Thank you.
So I guess we're moving on to the questions section. If you can submit your questions to the Q&A tab on this, it'll be great. One thing I'd like to ask is, from each of you is, with the economic downturn, with the closing of a lot of workplaces and such, how has that impacted rural students, do you feel, differently than students from more urban populations? I know, Sheila, do you have?
Well, as I mentioned, the opportunities for engaged learning are have become more limited. But on the other hand, small businesses and rural businesses need help. And so to the extent that faculty can create those partnerships that allow students to have some hands-on learning with community organizations and small businesses, they can be of significant help. You know, there are examples out there of students who have really pitched in to help small businesses survive the pandemic by helping with PPP loans, or you know, identifying issues that need to be addressed, and as a facilitator in a group discussing social justice issues and those sorts of things. But on the other hand, the opportunities for students to have jobs, some of those students may need those jobs in order to be able to maintain their education. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, if their families are losing income as well, so they may need to, you know, be frontline workers in order to support their families. So I think that, you know, there's definitely a push and pull, and, you know, a hollowing out of resources available to students to be able to stay in school.
Kyle or Margaret, do you have?
I'd echo that as well. The rural students, you know, the jobs are starting to emerge now, and that's good. And one thing the pandemic hasn't done, like a normal recession might, is a normal recession, if there is such a thing, but the past Great Recession was, people tended to have to relocate in order to find work. Because the pandemic has functionally shut down the world, people haven't moved, which has actually saved some of the rural communities, like Sheila was saying. The workforce helping out has stayed put because everyone had to stay put. And as they reemerge, they can jump into the jobs that are emerging there, and or coming back online.
And I think a number of economists are predicting a big shift in the economy for various reasons. One being that a lot of employers, because they faced a shortage of labor, are automating, and so some of the jobs that were there before will not come back because automation has increased and it's sped up. The other factor that may be in favor of rural communities is the de-densification of jobs from urban centers towards more remote locations, because people have become more familiar with remote work. Employers are becoming more comfortable managing their employees remotely. And this really may open up some new opportunities for rural communities. And in fact, there's some programs at Utah State University where they are teaching communities how to take advantage of that trend. And so for students, learning how to be effective remote workers may be a good opportunity for them, and really a 21st century skill that they need to learn.
And so, and I'll add in, Dave, if I could real quick, because it depends on where people are from on this call. But in the state of Nevada, we have gaming and tourism and hospitality as our major sector that drives 65% of our state revenue. So when you talk about rebuilding and we say, but we can't put people side by side in large groups, that becomes a serious problem for our state. And so we are looking at ways to continue to expand the initiatives that emerged, 10 years ago with the great recovery of the Great Recession that include advanced manufacturing and those sorts of programs, a lot of online tech with computer and those things. And the students and the populations know that. And so they expect us to be able to implement that. And fortunately, we have federal stimulus money to help build those programs.
Okay, we have a question for Sheila. It says, Sheila just mentioned that rural communities may face opportunities due to lower density. Are there any of the panelists seeing this happening yet?
Well, I will point to, let's see, some, like I said, there's some rural communities that are taking advantage of training opportunities for both employees and employers to learn how to be good remote workers and then also to manage remote workers. And so we are seeing some of that happen. People, for a long time, people have talked about the death of distance. We really didn't see that play out for a long time, but I think the pandemic is actually forcing people to ask the question, is it worth it for me to pay this housing premium that I'm paying to be close to a job where the need for me to be close to that office is really reduced? I haven't had a chance to look at the statistics that you might be able to look at from like moving companies and so on with respect to where people are moving to, but I have heard anecdotally that there are a lot of people who are choosing more remote locations.
Margaret, I had a question for you. You were talking about how the home life has changed quite a bit for the students, having to learn and study at the home. Has this gotten their families, their parents, their grandparents, their siblings more aware of what the college experience is like, the learning experience for a college student is like? Have you gotten more involvement with families?
I believe that we have. I was mentioning that I work with our African-American students, and so I field a lot of phone calls from family members. I get the students to sign something that allows me to talk to their families, and I've actually had mothers calling in and asking me about what we're doing and trying to get a handle on what it is we're trying to achieve. So I've had a lot of conversations with family members where they had a lot of really good questions. And I believe that by the time spring semester was over, I would say yes. The connectivity that we now have with a lot of our families, we never had that before. And the students that came back fall semester talked about how their entire family had benefited by us giving them a laptop, because not only did they use the laptop, but if little brother had a science project to do, he got to use that with that hotspot too. And so I do believe that this, the experience that we had is challenging as it was. I do believe that we have all gained a tremendous amount of knowledge that we did not have prior to that. Even people that live where there are rural co-ops did not understand everything that they should have known about broadband. But through this experience, I think they're much more aware.
Kyle, do you have any experience with your parents or your families?
We found out the same thing. Actually, I find it interesting as we plow through this. If somebody asks, what is the most stressful piece of all of this? And I can't say it's the most stressful, but having funding that is technology specific that we could put in the hands of students, parents, and households, faculty members, and not being able to get it, or having so much money in that bucket that we don't necessarily need it there, but we need it somewhere else. So we've given out laptops so that they could share. I haven't thought about it. It's a good comment, Margaret, about the shared spaces in the homes. The shared spaces on campus we've done because a lot of them don't even have internet at home, and we've tried the parking lots. And then the parents, though, have been there to support, but I found the kids are supporting parents almost as much. So I may have drifted from the question, but I have a student in my class who, I've had to be, I feel like I need to be more flexible than I usually am, and I'm pretty flexible, but I've said, basically get the assignments in and don't worry about it. And she was so nervous about it because she had like a grandfather went into the hospital, the parents went there, and then she was taking care of the kids at home. This is a 19-year-old first-year student, and that kind of stress on the system too. So again, drifted a little bit, but just some thoughts on that.
We have a comment. The migration to rural will be beneficial to the cost of housing for urban workers. It will, and is shifting the availability and cost of rural properties. General governments will be facing challenges to rural workers. The need for services that were not anticipated will create opportunities and challenges. Do any of you like to speak to those comments?
Yeah, I'll note that there's a fault. Looks like there's another sentence there too in the second one. So the migration piece at least in my world, there's not a lot of housing being built in the rural areas. So it's still very expensive. We actually found out that a student who's in our nursing program ended up getting upside down with the federal funds that have come through because the cost of living is so expensive and the aid didn't cover it. So that, again, that's a student perspective. What I'm finding on there's not really a migration yet, but what I'm finding is that the economic development pieces that were in play pre-pandemic are still moving forward. So when we talk about industrial complex that are going to go up and provide a whole bunch of jobs, then there'll be housing to the side of it. I see that as being the next step in the migration piece.
I think building those partnerships with those potential employers in order to make sure that housing is part of the equation is incredibly important because in a lot of cases, the markets just don't really understand rural communities for housing. So it's hard to get financing to build housing in rural communities. And without housing, childcare, and other sorts of wraparound services, it's really difficult for someone to make their way from maybe a job that's disappeared or no job into a job that might pay them a living wage. And identify the education that's required is only one piece of it. They also have to be able to take care of their other needs.
We have another question that was posed. Margaret's comment about some of the positive outcomes of the pandemic make me want to know what the panelists would say they would like to keep in post-pandemic times. What are the good things that ought to continue?
I'm going to jump ahead. I was going to jump ahead on this one because I saw it coming. So interestingly enough, I think we have shown higher education that we can operate in a remote environment. And the technology piece is huge. And I'm not saying we need to do Zoom classes in 100% Zoom, but when I was mentioning in my opening statements and remarks about the USDA grant, the original intent with the Zoom technology for that project was if we had a student who couldn't get to campus because their car broke down, maybe they're disabled, maybe it's a snow day and they drive. I mean, we have some routes that are 100 miles. So some of you have more than that they could actually participate in the class, not on a permanent basis, but just to get over the hump and not miss it. And that was the original intent of that. We never saw anything coming like a pandemic, but it fits right in. And so the technology piece on the student side to access is what it's all about, to get them into the classes and be able to take them. Right now, we're running EMS classes where the lectures like this, the hands-on is at all the sites. And that's one benefit. The other one is that I've got staff now. I've actually got one staff that moved during the pandemic out of state, but she stays on because she does our scheduling. So there's not a need for her to be on campus. I mean, if she needed to, she can have somebody go and measure a room if we need to, but our facilities does that. So we're able to deploy staff all around. People don't have to drive in. To be honest with you, when I'm on meetings like our shared governance college council, it's easier to see and hear people and see the handouts on a Zoom than it is when we go to a large lecture hall. So for me, it's definitely the technology piece.
I'd say one of the things that we came away with is the relationships piece. I believe this provided us with the greatest opportunity to really develop some real strong relationships, not only with our students, but with their families. And that isn't something that we would ordinarily do. I don't think that I've ever, well, maybe a couple parents I've talked to, but now I've probably got 60 or 70 parents that I've now been in communications with. So that relationship part was really huge. The other part of that is once you've communicated with family and they understand what this university is about and how hard you're working, it really increases their respect for the university. I've had a couple ladies say, I'm sending my sons because they have younger sons and they like the way that we treat them and the way that we really reach out for them.
Thank you, Margaret. And I'll add on to what Kyle said first, just by saying that although before the pandemic, we had good examples of cases like in East Carolina University, where they identified workers in the K-12 school districts who were interested in becoming teachers in rural communities where there's a huge teacher shortage, but couldn't make the trip to Greenville to do their four-year degree there. So they developed a relationship with the local community colleges and embedded a counselor in the local community college and put their, they did a 2+2 system and allowed the students to completely finish their degree online after they finished their first 2 years at the community college. I think that this opens up a huge amount of opportunity for rural students who are place-bound, who may not have had this opportunity in the past, because there's now so much content online. And I think that what we really need to innovate around is providing those students the social experience and the social connections and the collegiality that they need in order to make that experience as engaging as it can be. And so what I mentioned earlier about engaged learning, we're going to have to put a little bit more effort into that piece and figure out how students who are not on campus can also benefit from the engaged learning piece.
So I have a question. So what will you be focusing on in the coming months as the vaccine rolls out and we're able to meet more in person? What are the main focuses that you'll be looking at?
Well, from my perspective as a Chief Diversity Officer, I have not been able to do much face-to-face engagement with my students. I'll just be glad to be face-to-face where we're all in the same room and you can see body language and people are together again. That I really miss that, the human aspect of being together. I mean, Zoom and WebEx have done a great job, but when it comes to just being in a room with the student, to be able to spend an hour or so with them, we don't have that. We wear masks and everybody's pretty guarded yet because now we have that new variant in Montana. So we're probably going into some other phase here very shortly.
I think similar to what Margaret said, trying to figure out how to make it work on campus. I actually was able to guest lecture in a class. We were all masked up and a couple months ago last semester, and it was actually so nice to be in class with real people. And so even if we have to limit that and we still have some on Zoom, being able to get back to something that we call, and again, we're not going to go back 100%, but being able to get back there to where there's some face-to-face, mask-to-mask, however it works out, just for that social piece that for years, and I've got a couple that are in this generation, we always criticize the millennials and the younger than the millennials as being, antisocial and living on their phones. And yet they're the biggest ones affected by this and they want to come back in person. I actually think for higher education, we're going to have a big year this fall with people on site if we can offer those classes.
And just to take it in a slightly different direction, one of the things I'm going to be working on is there is quite a bit of money that's coming out in some of the proposed legislation to provide rural broadband. And I'm going to be working with the cooperative extension services in our at our land-grant universities as they will be developing and rolling out programs that will help people who have new access to rural broadband understand how to best take advantage of it and to stay safe. because there's a lot of people out there that want to take advantage of folks who maybe don't know how to protect themselves online. So that's one of the things I'll be working on.
Great. Thank you. Let's see, Anna, we're getting close to the end. Is there something you'd like to end with, or? Yeah,
just making sure there aren't any other questions or comments from our attendees. First, I would just want to thank Kyle, Sheila, and Margaret for their input today and speaking about their experiences. We really appreciate the time you've given to both the Alliance and forum groups and presenting on this important topic for the virtual meeting series. Just one more quick shout out to our sponsors, Civitas, Academic Search, College Board, TIAA, and Western Governors University and New Mexico Military Institute. And as soon as we have the recording up, an email will be coming out to those that were registered, asking for feedback with a short survey, and we'll let you know where to find the recording. And we did include some links in there today as well, and we'll post that information on our site and include the slides. Thank you all, and David, thank you for moderating. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.